Today is our, I think, fourth session of Space Camp. It's called Postman, an introduction for testers. So if you're not familiar with Postman, that's okay. We're going to go ahead and kind of get everyone familiar with Postman. The idea is that this is a webinar for folks that identify as testers, but may be new to Postman. So if you're new to Postman, if you're not new to Postman, we'll kind of cover all of the things you need to get started in Postman as a tester, and we'll cover all sorts of ways of testing and things you can do in Postman. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Carson, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Carson Hunter. I work at Postman as a technical enablement architect. So I work on the solutions engineering team and get to create technical content to help people kind of use the platform hopefully better and get the most out of it and kind of show all the things that Postman can do. So whether that's creating, example collections or workspaces or utilities, just love getting to work with Postman all day. And so previously I was a developer and was in the Postman Supernovas program. So I've been a Postman fan for a long time and am always excited to talk Postman.
Awesome. Thanks. And I'm Sean Keegan. I'm a developer advocate here at Postman. So my job is getting to do fun stuff like this, like teaching Space Camp webinars. I also get to talk with folks in the community, see how people are using Postman, bring that back to our team internally, and kind of be that liaison between external folks using Postman and our team here internally at Postman. So super fun. I get to talk with a whole bunch of people and talk about Postman all day as well. So cool. Here's the agenda for today. The first thing we're going to do is talk about what is API testing. I think, few people identify as an API tester as their actual role, but, a lot of testers do have to test APIs. And so that's kind of something that we'll cover today is various ways you can cover or test APIs. Then we'll get started with intro to unit testing in Postman. And so unit testing, people have, kind of different ideas or different definitions for what that means. So we'll kind of talk about what that looks like in Postman and, how to do it. Then we'll kind of get into some custom tests, so some more advanced use cases, some more advanced workflows and covering that. Then we'll talk about some resources. So if you want to take your learning further, we'll have some resources for you to go ahead and do that. And finally, the last 15 minutes will be a Q&A. So if you we encourage you to ask your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. We have folks in the chat ready to help out and answer your questions. So one thing I do want to mention, if you don't get your question answered immediately, that might just be because we're saving it to the end. And so we can have those last 15 minutes, not just be Carson and myself hoping that people ask questions, but that we have stuff ready for us to talk about. So that's the agenda for today. And let's talk about the learning objectives. So here's what we want to cover today. So the first thing is send a request and inspect a response. And so this is going to be kind of that introduction to Postman and how you can test an API or just consume and explore an API more than anything, and just familiarizing ourselves with the Postman platform. The next thing, like we talked about in the agenda, is going to be use a test snippet and write custom tests. If a test snippet is unfamiliar to you right now, that'll make plenty of sense as we get started. We want to extract data from one request to use in another with variables. So this is going to be kind of a more advanced workflow of making multiple requests in a row, taking information from one and using it in a subsequent request. Save and run tests as collections. This is again going to be kind of using multiple collection or multiple requests in a collection and having kind of a more advanced workflow. And then finally, explain different types of tests that can be written in Postman. And that's something we'll talk about, whether it's the unit testing, end-to-end testing, or contract testing. There are quite a few different things you can do in Postman. So the first thing to talk about is, what is API testing? And again, there are various ways that you can do this. And we'll kind of talk about examples for each of these. So unit testing, people have kind of different definitions of what this means, or depending on which area of testing you're talking about. But in general, for our purposes, we're going to say it's testing a single request that tests elements of the response. So making sure that the response from an API comes back as expected. And there are quite a few things in this that we can test. It could be the status code, the headers, making sure the body is contains elements that we expect, just making sure the behavior is expected. Then end-to-end testing. So as the name suggests, it's going to be kind of a more advanced workflow and testing throughout a whole process. And you can think of this as, a workflow of grabbing a product ID, creating a shopping cart, adding the product to the shopping cart, and checking out, and having tests kind of along the way. And at each, you'll have assertions at each step of the way. So that's kind of end to end, is making sure that whole workflow gets tested. And then the last thing is contract testing. And these are going to be tests that are based on some kind of contract that describes API requests and responses. So Open API is an example of this. And it can look a bit like unit testing, but the examples of what to expect will come from a contract. And so again, if this doesn't make a ton of sense right now, we'll dive into an example toward the end, and hopefully all of this will make a bit more sense with concrete examples. Okay. And now, so that's gonna be the end of the kind of talking session. And from here, Carson's gonna take over and kind of go into like a demo and a walkthrough of all the things that we talked about as our learning objectives. And you can see in the chat, we've posted the link to this workspace overview. But Carson's gonna go ahead and take over. And what we really wanna do here is, we've created this collection in Postman so that you all can follow along at home. And as Carson goes through, she's going to show us, how she's going to fork the collection and bring it into her own workspace so she can work on it. And that's really something we encourage everyone to do, is to fork this workspace.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. So if you grab the link from the chat, this is the page you'll come to. This is the Postman Space Camp workspace. So kind of the homepage that houses all of the different collections. If you've seen the previous Postman Space Camp webinars, all of those collections that they used were right here. So today we're going to be using this Postman and Introduction for Testers collection. And like Sean mentioned, we don't want to work right inside this kind of main copy that everyone's going to be forking from. So I'm going to show how we can create our own workspace and kind of get our own copy and go from there. So if we click on this collection name, you can see that we have our collection documentation, but we have this fork icon here. So we're going to need to fork that into our own workspace. But if you don't have a workspace kind of going already, we can create one using this new workspace button from the workspace dropdown. So I'll go ahead and create one, and we'll call it Space Camp. And I'm going to make this just a personal one. So it's only going to be me accessing it. Maybe we'll make it a team one. Okay. And then move my zoom elements. We'll create the workspace. And now we can see it's empty. And so now we need to go back and get that collection we were just working on. So maybe you don't have the link handy. We can go ahead and search Space Camp in this top search bar. And we can see this Postman Space Camp was created by Postman. So we know that that's the official workspace. We'll go ahead and click on it. And as it loads, we can go back to that collection and fork it. And I'll just say that this is Carson's fork. And we'll fork it into the new one we created called Space Camp. And then we'll be taken right to our version of our forked collection. And so now we can kind of get into a quick overview of kind of what we have here in our workspace page. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have our collections, APIs, environments. We're really going to be focusing on collections today, so we'll just stay in this top collections icon. If we click on our collection, you can see we have our, collection level authorization, pre-request test scripts, and variables. And on the right side, we have all of our icons like documentation, comments, all of that good stuff. So Sean, when you're coming to kind of a new workspace, where do you like to start? How do you kind of get started?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two lines of thought. I think some people just try to click the send button and send the first request right away. I personally prefer to look a little bit at the documentation. And so the area you're in is exactly where I look and just see if the collection itself has any documentation or information on getting started or what I can expect to find in this collection itself.
Nice. Yeah. So this collection level documentation gives a great overview of kind of what we're going to be going over today. It's got the learning objectives, some information on how to get started, signing up for the Postman Space Camp webinars, and some additional links. So let's kind of dive into some of these API calls. So if we go into this first folder called Library API Reference, you might recognize this API from previous Space Camp sessions. It's about, getting books from our Postman library. And this first folder is kind of our, reference. It has all of the possible API calls before we start getting into more advanced workflows. So we'll click on one of these requests and let's take a quick look at everything that's kind of in this request page. So to the left, we have our list of the different request methods. Today, we're mostly going to be sticking with gets and posts, but there are so many here that you can explore with your own APIs. And then we have our URL bar where we can, define the API that we want to call. And then we have this send button that allows us to actually send the request. But kind of going back to this URL bar, you might notice that we have some curly braces and a variable here. So this curly bracket notation is something you'll see across Postman, and it indicates that we've got some text that's been extracted out into a variable so that we can reuse it. And if we hover over this base URL variable, we get some more information. The yellow C indicates that it's a collection, which you can see in the scope as well. And it has the kind of host of the URL we'll be using so that we can reuse that easily without having to type it over and over and possibly misspelling it. So if we wanted to kind of check and manipulate that value, we could go back to our collection and click on this variables tab, and I'll close this documentation, and we can see this is where we can edit that value and define other variables here. So going back, let's try and send this request and see kind of what else we can see in this pane. So you might also notice that we have documentation for the request level as well. This request is getting all the books in our library database, and there's some search parameters we can use, request parameters. If we wanted to kind of narrow down our search, we could toggle those on and off as well. So now we've got some information coming back, and it looks like we've got some books in our library already. So you can see there are a few different toggles here. You might be familiar if you're used to sending curl requests from the command line. Your payload probably looks something like this. It's just a big JSON string, but Postman makes it really easy to kind of prettify and format it, make it a little easier to understand. If you had some HTML, you'd be able to render it with this preview view. And then if you had any visualized code, you'd be able to see it here. And then we have a few other pieces of information that have come back as well. We have our response code that tells us that this is a 200, okay. And Postman includes this kind of descriptor, so you don't have to remember all your HTTP response codes in your head. We have our response time. If you wanted to do some performance testing, that's something you can measure as well. And then the response size. So you can see how much data is coming back. So Sean, are we ready to start writing some tests? Did we miss anything?
No, I think this is good. I think the last thing to maybe point out just in this response section is the ability to save the response as an example, which we'll make use of for later requests to kind of design our test from.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you can use the save response dropdown to save it as an example or save to a file. We've already got some saved examples. If you open up these requests, you can see what the response is supposed to look like. So this is great. Maybe if you don't have an internet connection, or maybe the API isn't fully built out yet, but you know what the response is supposed to be, you can kind of reference this and build on top of it and even use it in a mock server. So let's head over to our test tab and start kind of defining what we want to do here. So on the right, you can see we have this snippets pane that has a big list of different tests we might want to write. So Postman kind of gives us these, and it's a really handy feature to be able to start out with tests and get a jump start on writing your test with this kind of blank slate test pane. So any of these, we could click on them and they'll be auto-populated. Sean, do you have any favorites that we should start with?
Yeah, I think probably the most basic thing we want to test is just making sure that we got kind of this standard 200, like everything is okay. And we actually had a snippet for that. So let's just check and see if we got, our 200 okay response.
Cool. So as soon as we click that, it's auto-populated. The code's already written. So let's see if we can just get a result. Awesome. So it looks like 1 out of 1 of our tests pass, and that was pretty easy. But we might want to, kind of dig into this a little bit and talk about, what's involved in a test. How do we make a test? So Sean, can you go over kind of the different parts of the test and maybe what makes a good test?
Yeah, for sure. So what we have here is, you can see from the start, it's pm.test. And so PM is a Postman object that has a bunch of methods that allow us to kind of create various things in this sandbox. And one of them is this test method. And so you can see, if you're familiar with JavaScript, and even if you're not, the codes or the format here is hopefully relatively easy to kind of plug and play and make sense of. So this pm.test takes 2 parameters. The first one you can see is the name of the test. In this case, its status code is 200. So that's just going to be a string that tells us, you can define what your test is supposed to be looking for. And the second parameter is a function, and that's going to be something that returns a Boolean. So you're going to have an assertion or assertions that kind of check on the various things happening in a request and make sure the response has these certain parameters met. And in this case, it kind of reads a little bit like a sentence, right? It says pm.response to have status 200. And so really what that's going to do, that assertion is going to return essentially true or false. And if it's true, that's going to give us a passing test. And if it's false, it will tell us the test fails.
Yeah, and this uses chai.js as the testing framework kind of under the hood. And so if you wanted to kind of dig into that syntax a little bit more, there's actually documentation for chai.js, or there's several Postman resources you can use as well. So let's do a little bit more testing and maybe show how we can do multiple assertions in the same test. So I'll start a new one, and we can kind of focus on making sure our response body is what we think it's going to be. So I'll do one that our response is valid and has a body. What are some things that might be good to test here, Sean?
Yeah, so I think what you're saying, right? If we want to make sure it's valid and has a body, a few things we can make sure. So we have some built-in assertions we can write. So let's do pm.response. We're going to kind of start with that again. And now we're going to say to be, and let's just go with okay. And that's something we have in here that should, give us that it's an okay response. Let's add another one. So pm.response to be, and let's say, because this is a GET request, we're expecting to get some sort of body back. So let's say with body as that one. And let's add one more. Let's say, because we're expecting the response to be JSON, we can say exactly that. So let's say pm.response to be, and just then JSON. So this is a good example. Right now we have 3 assertions in one test. And so this is all going to be one test. And for this test to come back as a pass, all three of these assertions will have to come back as true.
Let's see if we did it. Cool.
Woo-hoo.
So that worked. So we've kind of asserted the type of response body that we want, but maybe now we should go and make sure we're getting the actual data that we want. So if we head back over to our body, we can see that we're, getting these books with titles and IDs and genres. Maybe let's make sure that our first book is, the genre that we're expecting it to be. So I'll make a test about checking the genre. Start with our pm.test, and say book is of expected genre. I'll add our function. And so since we're not using kind of a built-in pm.response, we're doing something a little more advanced. We'll add in a pm.expect, and then we can do our pm.response.json, which allows us to kind of get this whole response body as a JSON object, and we can work with the properties of the JSON object. And let's kind of focus on this first book. So we'll get the first book by adding an index of 0, and we want to know about the genre. So we'll get the genre property. And then we'll use our chai syntax to get to, be, and then we'll say it can be one of several genres. Which genres should we test?
So let's say we know fiction comes back as one that we want. And I know computers is another category for our books. So let's add those to our, and since it's one of, Carson, we got to make sure it's an array, that these are in an array.
Good call. Cool. Let's see. Awesome. Looks like we got 3 out of 3. We should probably make sure that these fail though, and that we're not just, getting a fluke response. So if we didn't know anything about this book, maybe we thought it was a cookbook or a book about nature, would we still be right? No. So not usually good to see a failing test, but good in this case, I guess.
Yeah.
So it might be good to, since all of these requests are returning kind of a JSON body, we could probably pull all of these, some of these into a collection level test or folder level test so that we can kind of reuse these little snippets that we've written. So I'm going to take, this, and let's just go into our folder and give ourselves some space. And we'll paste that there. And this will be applied to all of the requests within that folder. So they should all be okay. They should all have a body, and they should all be JSON. So if we move to this next request that we haven't started working with yet, you can see we don't have any tests here. But if we send it, let's see.
So I don't think we've identified a specific ID yet. So
right. So it's not coming back as okay. So
yeah.
we will grab the ID from one of these. Just to test it. So now we've met all of our criteria. The response is okay, and it has a body. So we didn't write any tests specifically here, but all of our tests were applied, which is pretty cool. Awesome. So let's see, should we go into our new book workflow?
Yeah, I think so, right? So we can talk briefly about what this new book workflow is. And this is going to be where we kind of go through, what we did before was just adding tests, kind of the unit testing idea where we're testing individual requests and testing to make sure the response came back as expected. Now we're going to get a little more advanced and just see if we can, add a new book and kind of check that book out immediately. And so to do this, we're going to have like a full workflow with a few requests in a row. And so Carson's going to walk through maybe adding some tests along the way to make sure that this process goes as expected.
Right. So now that we've got our library running, we're going to need to automate some things. So we'll go into our add book request. And so here we'll add our book, and then we'll get all the books in our library, and then we'll update the book to check it out to make sure we get the book that we want. So here we're doing a post request, and you can see we already have some information in the body, the request body pane. We're trying to check out the book Dune. And so we're going to be working with this title a lot. So we might want to pull out this title into a variable just so we don't mistype it and we can reuse it within our test. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and we'll put in a book title variable. So we haven't defined this anywhere. I've just used the double curly bracket notation, but let's go back up to our collection and add it in so that we can reuse this value anywhere we want.
So Carson, while you're adding this, I just want to add one quick point and say that, folks at home, like this is a fully working API. So if you want to add your book to the library, make sure you fork the collection and you can go ahead and test these endpoints and add your own book to the library. And Yeah, so you can do the same tests and add whatever books you want. But I just wanted to point out that folks, you can do this as well.
Yeah, and we'll see your books coming back as you add them. So now we've got our book title defined, and we can go ahead and write some tests. So maybe before we add our book, we'll want to make sure that we're getting the expected response when we do. So if we go up to our reference folder, we can see what this is supposed to look like when we add a book successfully. So once this works, we'll get a message that says, okay. So we might want to write a test to just make sure that that process went okay. Sean, are there any snippets that you like for this type of situation?
Yeah. So one thing that's nice about Postman is, right, we've kind of thought about some of these common use cases. So I believe, have a snippet called post request okay, or something along those lines, checking for the status code. And yep, so status code successful post request. So this kind of covers, the responses. Now we're looking for, either the response code to be 201 or 202. So that's one thing we can check. We also have another thing for these. I think there's another like post was okay. So we can, I'm looking for, we can just do status code has string created. Yep. And because this is a post request, we should have something being created. It should say like 201 created. And if you go back to the example, Carson, in the post book example, we can see that, that is exactly what we should see in the status code. So that these are good tests to have.
Cool. So let's see if these work and if our book was added. Awesome. Looks like we got both a successful response and all of our tests pass. So maybe we should go ahead and check the library to see that it was actually added to the library.
Yeah, I think we can, let's even be more thorough, Carson, and we can add even one more test here. And just because we're using variables, we just want to be, make sure that we're being careful. Actually, we'll test that in the next one. Because our body, the response body here only says okay, we're not going to test anything yet with the variables. So I got ahead of myself.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and so this is kind of the same request we were working on with before, getting the list of all of the books. So we can see that our book was added, but let's make some tests to just make sure that we don't have to check this manually every time, because we do have a library to run. We have some other jobs. So let's see, we can get our collection variable that we defined before, so we don't have to manually type that in. We'll define a variable, we'll call it book title, and we can use our PM dot, and this pops up automatically, but if you weren't sure of the syntax, you'd search through these methods and it'd be super easy to find what you're looking for. And we can get, and we'll say, I think we saved it as book title. Yep, it auto completes.
Another thing to point out, Carson, if you weren't at all familiar with the syntax, there is a snippet for getting collection variables too. So I think if you scroll down on the snippets, you'll see get a collection variable, and that would populate that exact thing that Carson was just writing. Nice.
Yeah, that's good to know. So let's see. So we'll want to make sure that our book title is in this list of books. So let's do a pm.test. And then we're feeling a little fancy. So let's use the backtick syntax, and we can kind of do some text replace using our book title variable. And we'll say that it's added to library. So this will say that our book title, which we're hoping is Dune, has been added to the library. So we don't have to kind of make a different test for each of those different variables. So we'll add in our function. And we'll say PM expect. We'll just say maybe that Dune exists in the whole, response text. Just make sure it exists. We have pm.response.text. This is an alternative to getting the JSON object. This will just search it as a text string. And we'll say to include, and then our book title. Okay. And let's see if that worked. Awesome. Well, looks like our tests are confirming what we can see, that Dune was added to our library. And so final step of this process, I guess, is to check it out so we can actually read it. So we can see this one is using a patch method, and we're passing in this ID. Oh, I guess we need to set an ID variable to make sure we're getting the book that we want. So is there a snippet for this as well to kind of set it? Yep.
Yep.
Cool. So let's just set this as ID like we saw in the patch request, and we'll pass in we know this is the first book, so we'll get PM response JSON, and then we'll get the first one, and then we'll get the ID. So we'll send this to make sure that the ID gets set. And then if we go here and we hover over our ID variable, cool, it looks like our ID was set. So if we go over to the body, all we're doing is updating this book object to say that this book was indeed checked out. So what kind of test would we need to write to make sure this works?
Yeah, so I think we can kind of do a similar workflow to what we did before, where exactly what you're hovering over. Or let's see what a successful patch request looks like. We actually have quite a few examples here to work against, which is pretty nice. So I think before we go about any tests, we can take a look and see if it's successful. We should get, this. Actually, we have a little bit of a discrepancy between the name of the example and the status code. So we'll want to be careful there. I think it probably is going to be 200. But so this is what a successful test looks like. And let's look at the 404 example and the 500. Cool. Okay. So when I see this as an example, a few things stand out to me. We have a status that has the string error, and a message talking about various things that went wrong. Let's look at the 500 as well. Cool. Okay, so we have a different message, but we're seeing that same status with the string error, which is gonna tell me that maybe that's a keyword we should look to avoid for our test to be passing. So I think that's when we go back now to our actual request, we have some information about what a successful and a not successful request look like. So given that, I think we can say, let's come up with a test that kind of avoids that string or says it doesn't have that string error in it. So if we look through our snippets, I think there's something that says response body contains string. And here, right, so body matches string. We can be a little bit more specific. And so one of the nice things about Chai.js is the ability to kind of negate an assertion pretty quickly. So instead of saying to include the string we want to search, we can just add the word not in there. And this will kind of flip it to the opposite. And in this case, the string we wanted to search for was error. And yeah, basically this is just going to say this assertion is making sure that the error string is not in the body. So yeah, I think that's one test we can look at. What's another thing? I think
we might want to kind of unset our variable so the next person isn't also checking out Dune. Is that something we can do?
Yeah. So I think we are going to have, actually, I don't know if we have a snippet for this, but what we do have is, the methods built into the Postman sandbox here. So I think PM dot collection variables, and now instead of setting or getting, really what we want to do is unset it. And now we can look at our ID. And then I think the last test would be, we just want to confirm that we've kind of cleaned up our workflow and don't have anything else kind of like clouding it. If we want to go through this workflow again, there's no leftover variables. So we can actually go ahead and put in a test that has an assertion looking for various collection variables. So we can do the same kind of PM.test again here.
Maybe variables cleaned up.
I like that.
Cool.
And if we think about what we're really, go ahead, Carson.
Oh, I was just going to say we'll start with a pm.expect since it's not the property of the response. Start with that.
Yeah, I love that.
Then we'll need to make sure that our collection variable and make sure that it equals undefined.
Yep. Yep. Because we're not, we're unsetting it. That's what we should expect to happen, that it returns undefined.
Cool. So let's see what we get. Awesome. So no errors are found. Looks like we unset our ID. Let's see if we hover over. Yep. Looks like our value isn't there anymore. And we've cleaned up successfully. So
I think, Carson, we could also maybe add, if we wanted to be even more dynamic, removing the book title, because, in the future, we'll probably be doing other books.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I don't think yeah, sorry.
Oh, we'll just kind of copy what we've already done here and make sure we're including book title here as well. We can add another assertion.
So I imagine this is going to give us errors now because we've already gotten rid of the ID, which is totally fine. But actually, it's nice that the variables cleaned up test passes, because that, in theory, would mean that this workflow is set up for future runs if we start from the beginning.
Right. So if we did want to run this from the beginning, we could actually use the collection runner for that, just to make sure our whole workflow is working. So if we want to get to our collection runner, there's a couple ways we can do this. We could go run our whole folder by clicking on the folder and clicking run. And there's also the runner button down here where you could drag over your whole collection, but we'll just do our new book workflow. And so this will run all of these 3 requests in order, including all the tests we've written. So hopefully it does, the setting and unsetting of our variables in the right order, and our whole workflow is automated. So we'll just leave all of these settings as they are, and let's try it and see what happens. Cool. So we did get a failure. So our get books assertion, we expected book title, which we did unset. We weren't planning for that, but if we go back and set it, it would pass. Should we do that real quick?
Yeah, I think so. I think I got ahead of myself by saying we should remove it, but I forgot that we needed it for the workflow to actually work.
So I think Dune would be our first one. Let's try it again. Cool.
Woo.
That was easy.
So let's stay on this tab for just a quick sec, Carson, and kind of talk about what's going on here. This is a good example of kind of the end-to-end testing and making sure that throughout the entire life cycle of this workflow, we have kind of tests along the way, and it gives us this full picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and so we could filter them by what passed and what failed. If we had some that failed, they would show up here. But yeah, that's about it for collection runner. And now we could move on to our final type of testing, which is contract testing. This one's a little bit more advanced. And so Sean, how I understand contract testing is that when you're building your API, you kind of define your API specification, and you're wanting to make sure that what you've told people your API is going to return in your API specification is that what's actually coming back, so that you're keeping your promise. Is that about what you're thinking this is? Yeah,
I think that covers it, right? Just making sure that what you're testing, you're not testing against something that you're writing. It's this kind of agreed upon contract, and can make sure that what you're sending out it works or is valid against this contract that exists.
Cool.
So I think for the interest of time, Carson, let's, we'll kind of go through this one a bit quick so we leave enough time for the Q&A. But I will point out, if you are, we will have another session in 2 weeks, which we'll talk more about, and they'll cover more advanced testing. But so we'll go through it a little bit quickly, but we also have more resources on this as well.
Yeah, luckily we've already have some code pre-written, so it'll be a little easier to kind of go through this. So what we have here is we have our schema object already kind of defined in a Postman variable. So you can see some information about our schema. This is hosted at a URL that you could go visit and look at that. And then if you update your schema, you kind of update the URL here as well. And it goes through and tells us we're expecting an array and some different properties on the item that we're expecting and the type that they should be. So if we go down here, we're saving our response as a JSON object called JSON data. And then we're using our Postman test syntax, pm.test, to ensure that we're getting the expected response structure. So we're getting a variable called validation, and we're using this TV4, which is the built-in tiny validator. So this is something that's included in kind of the Postman sandbox editor that you don't have to, import or define it. It's just already there for you. And we're calling the validate method. We're passing in our JSON data, which is just our whole response, and our schema variable that we defined up here. And this will give us back a validation Boolean, so either true or false for being valid. So we'll expect validation to be true. So let's run it and see what we get. Cool. Looks like all of our books are aligning to the schema. We've kept our promise to, what we said we were going to return with our books, and it's looking good. Anything
Awesome.
else we want to test?
No, I think for this one, we'll kind of leave it there. The quick thing to point out is, in this case, we are hard defining the schema here in the sandbox, but in theory, you could, do it against the URL where it has, more dynamic, up-to-date, schema definition, but we just have it kind of hard-coded in here. But I think that's all for now on, the actual walkthrough. And so I think I'm going to take over and just do kind of some recap and provide everyone with some more information. So
that's good.
Yeah. All right. You can see my screen okay, yeah, Carson?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. So yeah, in terms of learning objectives, let's just do a quick recap of everything that we learned today. Hopefully you're able to, send a request and inspect a response. This is the first thing that Carson went through, just like the overview of the Postman interface, clicking the blue send button and seeing the various things that come back, like the response body, the headers, the status code, etc. Using a test snippet and writing custom tests. This is where we expanded that pane on the right side, click the various snippets and use them as a starting point for writing our tests and adding in various assertions, both using the snippets and from scratch. Carson did both. And those assertions are kind of the key to testing, APIs. Extracting data from one request to use in another with variables. So this is that workflow where Carson was adding a new book, capturing the ID of that book and passing it on or saving it as a collection variable so that the next request could use that ID and make sure we were working with the same book and kind of using that workflow there. Saving and running tests as collections. This is where we use the collection runner to kind of work through multiple requests in a row and seeing the tests, the results of the tests come back for that whole workflow. And then finally, explaining the different types of tests that can be written in Postman. This is where we kind of talked about the unit testing of testing individual requests, the end-to-end testing, like having multiple assertions or multiple tests in multiple requests of a workflow. That's a bit verbose, but hopefully you remember that workflow of testing multiple things. And then we touched briefly on contract testing as well. So those are the learning objectives. Hopefully everyone feels confident in those. And if not, this video is going to be available on demand, so you can watch all of these again, work through on your own, try to follow along. So what's next? For folks that identify as testers, I think a cool thing that we have is the flow runner on deck. And what that is a no-code way of designing advanced workflows in Postman. So it's a really cool, really powerful feature that's coming out very shortly. And I think it'll be really exciting and a cool way to kind of allow all sorts of folks to be able to harness the power of Postman and create cool workflows. And some more, right? There may not have been as much, noise around releases and new features, recently. But that may be because we have some exciting stuff in the pipeline coming up. So keep your eyes out for that, and hopefully, some more stuff is coming up that's exciting. Additional resources. So Postman Space Camp, this is the workspace link that we shared earlier on. This is going to have collections for other sessions that we've had, including links to the video on demand and the slides if you want them. Each collection is documented, so you have plenty of information on how to go ahead and get started, and the learning objectives for all of them. So you can kind of get a feel for what the takeaway should be for those. Intro to writing tests with examples. This is a specific collection. And so it goes into even more depth than some of the things we covered today. Just another collection that you can go through and get, get some practice or see different examples and fork it from there. Community forum. This is an area where, quite a few Postmanauts are pretty active. You can ask questions, talk about events, see other things that are upcoming. It's a great place to get involved with the community. I know Carson was active on there, and, we've seen her before she joined Postman. Yeah, great place to go get help and for additional resources. And then the last one is Postman Answers. And that is another public workspace that has all sorts of information and collections on, common questions or common roadblocks for folks with examples and answers for how to work through them. Okay. And now let's go ahead and do the Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Carson, so it's, our faces here. All right, and let's see, we've got a few questions. So hopefully, if you didn't get your questions answered during the actual session, Carson and I can go ahead and answer them now. So first one I see is, hi, can we send another request to the endpoint from the test code? So Carson, any thoughts there? I think I understand the question.
Yeah, so I might be wrong, but I think Clarissa is saying, maybe in our test code, can we send a request maybe asynchronously? And Postman does allow for that. You can set up a request to be sent in your pre-request test script. So before you send your URL or afterwards, there are several examples of that, on the community forum and in the Learning Center, where people document, how to send those, defining your URL, your headers, your authorization, all of that. So that's definitely possible.
Yeah, and another thing to point out there is, you can, in that Postman sandbox, you can programmatically set a next request and add some kind of conditional logic as well to, send another request based on if something happens. So that's another option.
For sure.
Cool. Let's see here. We've got, can other people see if you make an account public? So for this one, I think what might be being asked is if you're talking about public workspaces. So for these, it's one of the things worth noting is kind of the various permissions you can grant people. So if you have a team workspace, nobody can see Carson's team workspace that she was working in unless she specifically adds you. That's going to be private to her and the team members. Public workspaces, on the other hand, are public, so everyone can see those. You can toggle your profile public so people can see that, or you can make things private. So it really depends. You have control over what people see for the most part in terms of public versus private stuff. Okay, let's see. So how do you get around CSRF and OAuth 2 barriers that have timeouts? So access tokens and refresh tokens. So there is a way to kind of automate the token renewal. And so we have a blog post that talks about that. You can go ahead and manually refresh it. I don't know, Carson, if you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of OAuth 2 experiences, but I know that there are several blog posts. I think Danny Dayton, maybe Alan Helton from the community have written up, very detailed ways that you can kind of get around those timeouts and automatically refresh by writing some code in your test scripts. So those answers are definitely on the community.
Yeah, and so it looks like Mina just added a link to some of those blog posts. So yeah, I know for me, the blog post by Alan was super helpful when I had to do it. So on a previous live stream, we had one of our teammates here, Arlemy, had to go through some OAuth troubles and use community answers and stuff that folks had put on. I think it was Stack Overflow. So the community is quite involved. So hopefully we can keep that up.
You can always rest assured that someone has probably had the same question. So there's always answers to find there.
Yeah. Cool. So here's another one. Can we assign multiple values to variables to perform repetitive testing with different combinations like data-driven testing? Or is there another way, or is there a way to provide a file or Excel for data? If you're not familiar with this question is asking, we're trying to break it down a bit more. So basically, if you have repetitive testing and you have different kind of inputs and stuff, how can you handle that? And the answer for this is going to be the collection runner is a great way to handle this. You can upload a file, and I think Carson, are you able to share your screen again? It might be worth looking at. You can just look at the same collection that we were looking at before.
Cool. So are you seeing my Space Camp?
Yes. So if we go back, to this area where, right, so this is the collection runner, and you can, drag over, a folder or request. It doesn't totally matter. But here, the thing to point out is this area on the right where it says data and then select file. This is going to be an area where you can upload, like a CSV file, or truly like whatever you want. But the CSV files are read by Postman, and so depending on the structure of your data or whatever, you can go ahead and pipe in information directly from the CSV. Anything I missed, Carson, or?
Yeah, no, you explained it well. There's articles going into it, but basically you just have your header value match up with, whatever value you want to fill in Postman, and you're able to run that and fill in, multiple variables worth of data. Super useful.
Cool. Let's see. It looks like we're getting, more coming through still, which is nice. Is it possible? Let's see. To do contract testing again, is it possible to do contract testing against an XML schema within Postman? Do you know offhand, Carson?
That's not something I've done, but I would guess that you'd be able to. I know Postman, there are several projects working with XML that help you do that. So I haven't had experience, but I'm guessing that's something you could do.
Yeah, so I similarly don't have experience doing that, but I would imagine there's some way to convert an XML schema, whether it's something built into Postman or something that somebody else has done, and you can find kind of information on how to do that, whether it's on the community forum or elsewhere. I've got to imagine if that is possible. Cool. I think that might do it for now. We're getting close to the hour mark here. So just want to make sure that we finish with everything else that we're looking to cover here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again because we do have a survey for everybody. So give me just a sec. If somebody can add the link to the chat or add the survey to the chat, we really want to see what folks say. So I'm going to share my screen again. So you can go ahead and enter this URL directly into your address bar. It should also be available in the chat. But this is truly something that we look at closely. We want Space Camp to be something that fits with what people are asking for and find helpful and valuable. So please, I think it's only, five or six questions, but we really do look at it and take that feedback seriously. So, please do that, and we'll make future Space Camp sessions applicable. And speaking of future sessions, so thank you for coming to this one. I would be remiss if I didn't tout our next session in 2 weeks from now. We have one, continuous quality with Postman. And that's going to be kind of a follow-up to this session, talking about more advanced testing and ways you can automate the testing in CI/CD pipelines, using Postman monitors, using Newman, our collection runner for the command line. So there are quite a few other advanced testing cases that we didn't even touch on today. So really encourage everyone to go ahead and sign up for that one. So if we could add a link to the next session in the chat as well, that would be awesome. Really hope to see everyone at that one. That's going to be with Joyce Lynn and Neil Studd, two folks that I truly love learning from, and I think it's going to be an awesome session. So any other final thoughts, Carson?
Not that I can think of. I'm excited to dive in a little deeper to testing with Neil and Joyce. I know they'll have some great insights and ways to kind of automate your workflow as well. Awesome.
Cool. All right, everyone. I think that's all for now. I'm seeing that the survey link is not working, so we'll get that fixed immediately, because we do want to get your thoughts. So thank you very much. See you at the next session. Have a great day.